Reteach, podcast for teachers seeking fresh viewpoints, deeper subject knowledge, and diverse thinking.
Hi everybody, and welcome to this latest episode of the Reteach History podcast. We're into series 2 now, and I'm absolutely delighted to have with me Emmy Quinn. Emmy Quinn is a history teacher leading Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 in a middle school in Northumberland. They're quite a rare thing these days, middle schools. She has previously worked as a head of sixth form, so she's seen it from all ages and stages, and a sixth form mentor. Emmy is passionate about history and has presented at the school's History Project Conference and the Historical Association Conference. She's a member of the Northeast Historical Association Committee, and she's co-author of the recent Hodder History and New Focus on ... the British Empire 1500 to the present day. And what I'm going to chat to Emmy about is Irish history. So, Emmy, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you, Carmel. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. Now then, Ireland is our nearest neighbour. I mean, I was looking this up, and would you believe 19 kilometres, I believe, at the nearest point. And when I say our nearest neighbour, we're recording this in the north of England, both of us in the United Kingdom. So it's 19 kilometres from, I think it's the Mull of Kintyre over to Northern Ireland to the Antrim coast. And the United Kingdom has existed in its current form for only just over 100 years. Latest findings suggest that voters don't really know too much about or are indifferent to the union arrangements. And of course, Brexit has seen renewed debate around the status of Northern Ireland. Now, around 350,000 people in Britain today, including yourself, I hope I'm right in saying, were born in the Republic of Ireland. Is that correct?
Northern Ireland for me.
Northern
Very
Ireland.
Close to the Republic, but
very close. I thought you're a borderline lady.
Yes, I am. Yes,
you are, absolutely. I'm recording from the border city of Carlisle here, so we're all about the borders and the union. And although numbers of Irish people coming in to the United Kingdom are declining, around about 6 million of the, so 10% of the population have got Irish parents or grandparents. So the first thing I wanted to ask you really was, why should we bother putting a teaching focus upon Ireland? We have crowded curriculums. Professor historian Jane Allmeyer speaks about Ireland serving as a laboratory for imperial rule. So would you agree that it was kind of the first colony, a test bed?
Absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt. And it's one of the things that frustrates me and has in the past about empire history. When historians and people have been talking about empire, I often feel like it is just left out. You know, people don't mention it. And I think that's one reason to have it in our curriculum, because it does kind of get neglected in that respect. And I think people get the impression that Ireland has always been part of a United Kingdom. And we obviously know that's not true. And I mean, for the reasons you just listed at the beginning as to the amount of people with Irish heritage that are living in the UK, I mean, that more than anything should be why we should be fitting it into our curriculum in terms of that relevance. But back to the laboratory for British Empire, it 100% is. I mean, it begins in the 1100s, as I'm sure you know. I'm not going to go back into the sort of the long history, but it is somewhere that resists for a very long time, and where things are tried out and failed. And by the time Britain is really, well, England, first of all, I am very pedantic about that, let's be fair, England are spreading out into other colonies. They've had their fingers burnt a number of times in Ireland, and they've learned what not to do. And it's not to say it's successful. So I have been listening to David Beaver's The Great Defiance, and his first chapter is on Ireland. One of the things that stuck out to me is he said, just because it's a laboratory for British Empire doesn't mean it was a success, doesn't mean that it always went well. And I think that's one of the things that the English especially learn is all of the things that have gone wrong, they effectively learn not to do it again. And so one of the big reasons why Ireland is not very successful from the word go is those who come over and settle in Ireland and who become the sort of the English aristocracy in Ireland, they integrate. Instead of staying separate from their subjects, they integrate. They become, as a quote, more Irish than the Irish. They speak Irish. They marry local Irish people. They follow all the Irish laws and customs. And subsequent kings get very angry about this, and they try numerous times to intervene and to do something to stop this. And that is something that I think we can all agree when it comes to the wider empire. That's something that the British don't do and the English don't do. They do not integrate with their subjects in the other colonies. And that is a lesson very strongly learned in Ireland, that it went wrong for them on numerous occasions, because the people who were supposed to be loyal to the crown end up actually absorbing the Irish way of life. And so I think that's one of the big lessons that they learn and therefore do not repeat in other places. There's so many examples as to how it is the laboratory for British rule, but it's there for so long. It is part of England's history for such a long period of time that it has to be included in any teaching of empire, in my opinion. At this point, Carl, I'm worried that I'm about to just give you a history lesson. So.
No, fire away, because this is the whole point, Emmy. You know this, and without any disrespect to any of our listeners, many of us don't. So fire away. A mini history lesson is absolutely fine. Pretend we're your class. Go on.
The bottom line is, so Ireland is effectively under English rule from the 1170s. Anybody who's taught King John, for example, to their year 7s will know this, because he gets a sort of honorary title, Lord of Ireland. And from then on, we have an English presence in Ireland, but it is a very, very weak English presence, and it's very weak for a long period of time. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the Pale, or heard the phrase beyond the Pale. The Pale represents that little area, sort of 20-mile radius around Dublin, and that is where English rule is concentrated for a very, very long time. And we get lots of different kings over time trying to gain more territory in Ireland, and then deal with their own subjects in Ireland who are sort of neglecting the king and being very Irish. And really, by the time of the Tudors, we're starting to see English kings get more of a grip, English monarchs, then I suppose it becomes, on Ireland. Henry VII is one of the first people to really go, okay, we need to do something here. And that is in part because of challenge to his own crown by some of the Irish lords backing Lambert Simnel, and I think Perkin, as far as I'm aware, Perkin Warbeck as well. I'm sure some of them had thrown their hat in with Perkin Warbeck as well. And after that, we start to see a more concerted effort to get Ireland more under English control. But it takes a very, very long time. And Henry VIII obviously declares himself King of Ireland, because the Lord of Ireland title comes from the Pope. And obviously, he's done away with the Pope in the 1540s. But it really isn't until Elizabeth I where we see a proper grasp of real control over Ireland. And at that point, what the English have decided is that they need to really break the strength of these old Irish landlords who are very, who should be English but are in fact Irish. A number of them have been involved in rebellions. One of them is executed subsequently for involvement in rebellions. And then we start getting the planting of people into Ireland. And at that point, it becomes that divide in religion that I think people are very familiar with when it comes to Irish history. We start getting the planting of Protestants, and then Catholics becoming I wouldn't say at this point necessarily second-class citizens, but certainly Catholics being booted off their land, having things taken from them, and not allowed to settle on Protestant land, people coming in from England and Scotland. And at that point, we're starting to see a real colony emerge that we would probably recognise as a colony. But just because we don't recognise Ireland, it doesn't look familiar as a colony until that point, I would certainly say that it is before that. However, control is very, very weak until the end of the 9 Years' War, and then James I and the plantations of Ulster. And I'm sure we all know where the real control of Ireland finally comes from. The entire Ireland comes under the control after the Cromwellian settlement and everything that happens at that stage. So that kind of gives you sort of a very, very brief overview. Imagine having to condense that down into 2 textbook pages, which was quite a struggle. But yes, that bit in itself, I think, really has a place in our curriculum, because that shows us this early sort of foray into empire building, to colony building. Because I think if we start teaching empire at, looking at the Americas, for example, you're only getting part of the story. You would just think that they've picked this idea up off the ground, that we're going to start colonizing somewhere else, we're going to start planting places, when actually that idea has been there for a very, very long period of time. And there has been land taken over for a very long period of time. It is just somewhere where people, I think, just neglect to think about it having been a separate nation. So one of my big things is for teachers to acknowledge Ireland as an independent country before this. And I think that's something that is strongly missing in our general consciousness as a nation. I think sort of your average person on the street would struggle to tell you, when Ireland was not part of any sort of, United Kingdom. And I say that because I do think, as you've said, that the average person is possibly not even that aware when the United Kingdom came to be. And so I think it's really important to talk about Ireland as its own independent place before the English come along. And it wouldn't be correct to call it a nation, because it isn't. It's not under one king, it's not under one ruler. But the independence thing is what I really think does need to be emphasised in any teaching of Ireland, that it wasn't always part of English control and rule. There was a before. And I think the before is super, super important, as well as teaching that early introduction to empire as well.
You're very in tune with what's current there, Emmy, because the recent David Olusogun series on union speaks about some of the things that you've just mentioned. And historian Professor Jane Allmeyer talks about the plantations and the Blennerhassett family, and there are some spin-off open university resources that teachers may well like to tap into as well. So this is hot off the press. The series only came out this week. And I think you're probably right in saying most history teachers maybe have a general working knowledge of the famine in Ireland, or the Great Hunger, as it's known in Ireland. So thank you so much for filling in some of the blanks in terms of what has gone on before the famous potato famine. And what would you say, the famine meant for Ireland, and then the British hotspots that the Irish people came to?
The famine is just a huge moment in Irish history. It's obviously it's a huge period of tragedy, and you're looking at 1 million people died.
Yep.
From not actually, and I think this is something, this is sounding like my mother right now, because she will say this to me, they didn't die from hunger. Well, they didn't. My mother's also a history teacher, so I'll just shout her out right now because she'll love this. And they didn't die from hunger. What they actually died from was the associated sort of illness from being hungry and malnutrition. And it is absolutely horrific. The moment in history is absolutely horrific. And it is still something that I think makes a lot of Irish people, very mournful, very sad, because it's a horrible period of time. And if you read any of the primary sources around it, it is absolutely horrific. For Ireland, it means obviously a loss, of population of about 1 million people. This is not just in the countryside, and this is a misconception a lot of people have, that the Irish famine hit the countryside because those were the people who lived off potatoes, and that the west of Ireland was really, really affected, and it absolutely was. The west of Ireland was the worst affected, but the cities were also affected, because if you think logically, the people in the cities had to eat something, and that was also potatoes that were being imported into the urban centre. So actually, Belfast, Dublin, people are dying from malnutrition in these places because they're not getting the crops. There's also this almost belief that the north wasn't hit, and I think this is kind of almost a revisionist idea that, well, the north was more Protestant, more urban, but that's not true. It's absolutely not true. And if I think about my own town, I'm from Dungannon in County Tyrone. it was very badly hit. And we have a workhouse that was built at the time, graves that were there from the famine. All of Ireland was hit by this. Some places obviously worse than others, as well as people dying from famine. We get about 2 million people emigrating. That is a rough figure. I've seen a couple of different figures. I think the one I've gone with in the book was about, I think I said 1 million in the book, but I think if you count sort of the subsequent years after as well, you get closer to 2 million. A lot of them go to the USA, which I think is a very well-known thing. I think a lot of people think, oh, everybody went to the United States after the famine. Well, that's actually, that is one part of the story, but the closest place for people to go was England. And it made sense. It was the shortest journey. It would have been the cheapest journey. And so we get a huge wave of Irish migration into England and into Scotland. And that impacts us, today. There are so many communities around the UK with strong Irish links and strong Irish heritage because of the migration at that point in time. Look at Glasgow, for example. It'd be the one that sticks out for me, in Liverpool. There are two cities that I think their identity is very strongly linked with that Irishness. It has a huge impact on Ireland itself, and then it subsequently has a huge impact on England because we get huge waves of Irish migration, and we also have, for the first time, people really starting to question English policy in Ireland as well. And I think that's important to realize that there is an uncomfortable sort of feeling amongst some people in Britain as to how people are being treated during the famine. The very, very famous picture, which I didn't use in the book, I've used a different one, the Irish eviction, but it's from the same news article from the Illustrated London News. You have of Mary O'Donnell, Bridget O'Donnell, and with her children. The picture of her starving with her children. It's a real human interest story, and the reality of what's happening in Ireland is being people are seeing it in Britain, and we start getting huge money raising activities. We get charity going into Ireland at that point in time, even charity from as far as the Ottoman Empire, Irish abroad in India sending home money, and you get people questioning the British government and their strategy in Ireland for the first time. And I think that's really important as well, to note that it's very easy to think that it was, there were awful things happening from the British government, but actually a lot of people were very in tune that it was a tragedy and they needed to help as well. And so we get all of these people coming over to England, and as I'm sure anybody who knows, particularly of Irish descent, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, to move to England. Integration is not easy. Irish discrimination, I think, is well known in England. I think people are very aware that there was a lot of discrimination against Irish people. So I used to work in Gateshead, and we used to do a local study on the Irish and a migration into Gateshead, and the Irish were the biggest a bunch of migrants that came in, and the things that you see written about them is absolutely horrific. The things that people are writing about the Irish and how they've impacted the area, and when cholera breaks out, Irish are firmly blamed for cholera. Liverpool, the same thing. I think it's either typhus or typhoid epidemic is blamed on the Irish. So it's an uneasy sort of history. They take a while to settle in. There is discrimination. I think it is very difficult. The fact that most of these people are Catholic is at odds with a lot of England as well. And it is such an important aspect of history in the UK that you have this huge wave of migration that doesn't really stop. But the famine puts it started before the famine, but the famine increases the amount of migrants. And I mean, well into the 20th century, there's still huge waves of Irish migrants coming in. And even today, it is so common for people like myself to move from Ireland and come to England. And so I think it's another reason why it needs to be in our curriculum, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm so pleased you made the distinction there about rural Ireland and urban Ireland. It's just hard to break away from the stereotypes and think, therefore, about, Irish people. Yes, they came to Glasgow and Bristol and Liverpool, but they came everywhere throughout the country and into all kinds of jobs, beyond the typical navigational jobs of cutting the canals and the railways and so on. I was reading where, Irish people became doctors and drapers and landlords and clerks, and even in Hull, the chief constable was Irish, the editor of the Hull Advertiser, as far east as Hull. You think about the kind of front door, back door. I think, the great book you referred me to, Fergal Tobin's The Irish Difference. Fabulous book. He speaks about Dublin being 463 kilometres from London, whereas Calais is only 187 kilometres. So that the focus in the curriculums, perhaps, or the concerns of the governments has been to look at the front door, the channel where the Romans, the Normans, the Spanish Armada came from. And Ireland has completely been neglected because although it's the nearest neighbour, people are coming in through the back door into Scotland in the main, as well as you rightly said. And another great book, Bloody Foreigners by Robert Winder, speaks again about the Irish almost something of a racial slur, as if they existed only in the plural, like the measles. The Irish like the measles. So I'm so pleased that you're taking a more nuanced approach and encouraging teachers to do that. That's a really, really important message. You mentioned the 20th century there, Emmy. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about the story of 20th century British rule and the continuing migration that happened throughout that century as well?
I'm going to do that really annoying thing where I say, well, I can't really start in the 20th century because the story of 20th century British rule in Ireland, I think, really, we need to go back to the Union itself and why the Union came about, and that kind of explains a little bit more the British rule. And for those who don't know, in 1798, there was a rebellion in Ireland, the United Irishmen, who in themselves are fascinating. And I want people to actually teach the United Irishmen, if nothing else, because they are amazing. And the links we can have are fab. Just to go slightly off on a tangent, we couldn't fit this all in the book, but I really wanted to. The United Irishmen are anti-slavery, pro-democracy, suffrage, that sort of stuff, and they even invite Oloda Equiano to come and speak, and they organize sugar boycotts, and they're fabulous. They're absolutely amazing human beings in terms of what they stand for. They're incredibly liberal, and they're very much inspired by the French Revolution. They're mostly Anglo-Irish. They're Presbyterian or Church of England, but there are Catholics. And what they think is that, they're out for equality. They've got that real sense from the French Revolution that it's all about equality. We know, obviously, scratch the surface of the French Revolution, and that's not true, but that's what they want. And so they stage a rebellion because at the time, actually, Presbyterians are treated quite badly. They are not included as much in society. If you're a Church of Ireland, you get all the privileges. If you are anything else, if you're not a member of the established church, then you don't have the same sort of privileges in society. They stage a rebellion. It goes horribly wrong. And this is when the British decide, okay, we need to do something about this. We're going to keep the Catholics on the sort of rung of the ladder that they're at, where it is very difficult for them. They effectively can't own land. They can own it, but they can't necessarily pass it on to their children. There's certain professions you're more or less barred from being a Catholic. They decide that anybody who is a Protestant, regardless of denomination, can now have all of the same privileges as the Church of England, as the established church, and they keep the Catholics at that level, where they are still kind of subjugated. And that is where we start to see a big divide, where now there is a very big difference between Protestants and Catholics. It changes in 1831. We get Daniel O'Connell and Catholic Emancipation, 1829 onwards. And then we have sowing the seeds of Irish nationalism very strongly, and it becomes very heavily associated with Catholicism. So before that, it wasn't necessarily a Catholic thing. Nationalism was whoever felt that they wanted Ireland to be free, or at least have something, more effective home rule, for example, from Britain. The Act of Union takes away home rule. It makes Ireland, puts it under direct rule. And then in the 19th century, we get nationalism as we would probably recognize it a little bit more today, associated with Catholicism, associated with the Irish revival, the Irish language, sport, dance, poetry. And that builds and builds and builds. The famine helps. Certainly, it builds that sort of opposition to Britain more effectively. The Catholic Church becomes stronger after the famine as well, and so we get nationalism even more associated with Catholicism. And by sort of 1900, there is a very strong nationalist sentiment in Ireland, but there are Republicans who want a violent end, obviously, to British rule, and who are certainly not against using violent means. We've got nationalists who are asking more under Parnell, for example, for home rule, for an Irish parliament, not necessarily for complete breakaway from the United Kingdom. And that brings us sort of to the beginning of the 1900s. We've had a couple of attempts at home rule through Parliament. They've not gone very well. The last one about to go through in 1914, and everybody knows what happens in 1914, and therefore home rule gets shelved. World War I breaks out. We get Ireland taking part in World War I. Irish soldiers go out their troves, Catholics and Protestants. And then we get the Easter Rising in 1916. We get Republicans fighting for their independence. It goes badly wrong, but it is the moment that changes everything, because how Britain deal with the Easter Rising and the rebels really cements feeling in Ireland, particularly among Catholics, that it now has to be complete separation from Britain. And once that is sort of achieved following the War of Independence, and then there's the Civil War in Ireland. It's so convoluted. This history is so in depth. I'm doing a really broad sweep. Then we get partition, and again, everything changes. We get Northern Ireland, and we get what's called the Irish Free State, eventually becoming the Republic of Ireland later on. And so for one part of Ireland, British rule ends in 1949, when at the same time as a lot of other places in the empire. Another reason to teach Ireland, because it is happening at the same time as everywhere else. And partition as well, it was something that would be familiar to teachers of empire, this idea of partitioning a country. And it blows my mind, because it didn't work out very well in Ireland, and it's tried again in other places. And then we get into probably the period that people know the most about, which is when we start getting the Troubles from the 1960s onwards. That is the one that is probably the most taught in schools, I would say, in England. Used to be on GCSE spec. That's another thing to come back to. Ireland has been removed from most GCSE specifications. I'm not actually sure about OCR, but it certainly is no longer on AQA any longer. And that's where I would say most teachers would sort of pick up their knowledge of Ireland. So, Carmel, I don't know how much you want me to go into the Trouble.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fantastic. And I think there are probably opportunities. You've alluded to the French Revolution, you've alluded to home rule, but grassroots protest movements. I mean, I'm thinking James O'Brien, Fergus O'Connor, Chartists leading the way. So when you're teaching about Chartism, you can drop in the Irish heritage there, the roots and how these people came to be. There are probably opportunities to find links within what teachers are already doing to some extent.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I would advise with putting this into your curriculum.
Yeah.
I know our curricula are full, and this is what I have tried to do, is that I weave it in wherever I'm doing something else. And so I actually start with, I even talk about it when we study the Romans, because late Iron Age, England, Wales, because there's trade between the two countries at that point. England, Wales and Ireland have very, very strong connections. The Romans trade with Ireland. They never invade, but they trade. And I drop it in along the way so that they are aware of Ireland, of what's going on at the time. For me, being in the Northeast, it's easier because we talk about Anglo-Saxons and, we could talk St. Aidan and people like that. That's much easier to bring Ireland at that point. But that's what I would advise, is that weaving in. And yet, if you are teaching the French Revolution, look at the 1798 rebellion, because they are directly influenced by the French. And in fact, they are waiting on French help that doesn't really arrive. And, that's the links with the French are very, very strong. At that stage, they have the same ideals as the revolution. And it's a perfect place to have it in. And certainly with Chartism as well, to look at Catholic emancipation. Along with that, I mean, Catholic emancipation isn't something that just happens in Ireland. It is an English thing as well. It happens across, it applies in England, and so I think we think of it as quite an Irish thing because Daniel O'Connell leads the charge, but actually it applies to Catholics in England as well. So yeah, I do think there's so much opportunity to get Ireland in there. Without necessarily throwing out your entire curriculum and finding, places to put big chunks in, be weaved in. It would be ideal if you didn't have to, but I'm a realist. It's going to have to be, you're going to have to make decisions to get it in. And we always say this: when you put something in, you take something out. And,
of course.
And I don't think anybody should, take something really important out to put this in. But it's one of those things where you got to think about, why aren't you teaching it? And what would you get from teaching it? And I think with all those connections, it's a really solid reason to put it in.
Mm-hmm. No, really good point. I mean, you mentioned, the hostility that Irish migrants met with. I remember the horrific Punch representations, the Simeonization. That was a new word to me, which I never knew. The ape-like characteristics of Irish people. They were seen as uncivilized, unwashed, everything horrendous, as you rightly say. But would you say now, after all these long waves of global migration and the Irish diaspora being so far-reaching, would you say that in the main those of Irish heritage are successfully integrated? There are so many examples of highly successful people of Irish heritage in the media, on TV, in popular culture. So after facing persecution and racism in the past, would you say it's true that they're no longer seen as a minority group?
I think it's complicated. I think for the most part, yes, I would say Irish people are very, well integrated. I would certainly say, I would personally not say as an Irish person living in England that I face any particular issues, other than people, first thing they notice is my accent.
Which is beautiful, by the way. It's beautiful.
But I don't notice myself any longer, but it's the first thing people say. I would say, for the most part, yes, that is probably the case. And I don't think I can speak for everybody, though. But yeah, I would say very much so. And I think there is a lot of pride now in being Irish. And I think it's seen as something quite positive, I think, for a lot of people. And I think people love having Irish heritage. I notice this as an Irish person. They love to tell you that they have Irish heritage. I meet people all the time. They're like, oh, my grandmother's from Ireland, or, or have been, particularly Americans. They're very big on that. So yeah, I would say in the main, there's been a lot of integration. I would say really only the last maybe 20, 30 years, though. I think if you were asking me this 30 years ago, it would be a very, very different story.
Oh, without a doubt. At the time of the Troubles, people were hiding their Irish accents. And I know that from my own mother, now coming clean, is from Cork, and she would be often speaking in hushed tones so as not to be picked out as an Irish person, which kills me to think of as a child. But I want to just corroborate that and end on an uplifting high note. You've said you do not, face any prejudice or discrimination, which is brilliant. And Robert Winder in Bloody Foreigners, if I may, he says, from unpromising beginnings, the Irish developed into a success story. They stepped onwards and upwards into the centre of a country they simultaneously adapted to and altered. Their story gives hope for any future immigrants to these shores because the initial discomfort, however extreme, did not last forever. And I think that's beautiful and ties in exactly with what you have been said. I could actually talk to you forever, Emmy Quinn. It has been an absolute treat. The final thing I just want to ask you is, where could teachers go, students maybe doing EPQs or personal studies at A-level perhaps, if they have particular interest in Irish history? Could you point us in the direction of some resources or places to look to find out more?
Absolutely. BBC Bite Size is excellent. One of the things I always tell teachers to remember is that you might not teach this in England, but in Ireland they definitely do. And so there are resources out there everywhere for teachers in Ireland, and BBC Bite Size has a separate bit for teachers from Northern Ireland. There are so many books. I would be here all day listing books, but my favourite book, I think, to get a really good overview is called The Story of Ireland. By Niall Ferguson. It comes with a BBC series presented by Fergal Keenan, who you'll recognise from the news. It is fabulous, and it just gives such an excellent overview of the time period. And then for in-depth, I wouldn't even know where to start to give in-depth on period. One of the good things about Irish history is people love writing about it, and there are new books out all the time. But I think if you want that big overview, first of all, I think The Story of Ireland is an excellent place to start. There are a couple of really good websites like Irish Central. There's a couple of really good Irish history websites that just are good at giving sort of sources and just different summaries of various events. There is so much out there, to be honest, but that would be my one big recommendation as a book. Obviously our textbook, if you'd like a Key Stage 3 view of it, and things like there's no real short history of Ireland, I think, because it's not short. I've tried to find one. There is the likes of the Oxford Companion to Irish History. It's pretty good to give an overview, but yeah, that would be my main recommendation. The Story of Ireland is my favourite.
Fantastic. I think Roy Foster has written a few as well. And of course, we have some lists on the Reteach website. We have some reading lists linked to the Easter Rising, Irish perspectives on the Great Famine as well. So there are more pointers there if teachers want to follow things up. And I would really recommend that David Olusogun series that's on at the moment as well. Well, Emmy, thank you so much. That has been a really, really packed episode. We've had your viewpoints, we've had wide-ranging history lessons, we've had so many names and events dropped in. Really, it has been fabulous talking to you. And thank you so much for giving up your time and being a guest on the Reteach podcast.
Thank you so much, Carmel.